con decirle que el único hombre en la tierra capaz de unidad política de extirpar el fenómeno del narcotráfico es el que habla, Roberto Suárez.
¿Por qué, señor Suárez?
Por haber ido a la escuela, señora. ¿Usted cómo aprendió a leer y a escribir?
¿A la escuela de qué? ¿A la escuela de narcotráfico?
Hágame el favor, ¿cómo aprendió a leer y escribir?
Sí, pero tenemos escuelas, señor.
Así es, señora. Se necesita ir a la escuela para aprender. Yo fui a la escuela a aprender. ¿Ok? ¿Estamos claros?
This is Roberto Suárez Gómez. By 1985, he was the largest producer in South America. From his ranch in northern Bolivia, he ran the entire operation. He rode horses across his land, in full view of everyone, almost the owner of the country itself. The business ran on his word and on old codes. That's why the biggest cartels on the planet bought from him. In a single year, he brought in up to $400 million. And one of his customers was a Colombian the whole world would hear of, Pablo Escobar. Roberto Suárez Gómez was born in Santa Ana del Jacuma, in northern Bolivia in 1932. His family was wealthy and ran cattle, and the Suárez name carried weight across the country. He never needed anything when he was young. He worked the family ranch like any other son of a Bolivian landowner. By the mid-70s, he walked away from all of it for a new business. Cocaine was starting to move fast in the United States, and the Bolivian Amazon had the perfect conditions for producing it. Suárez understood what was happening before anyone else in the region. He started producing on a scale no Bolivian had ever reached before. He called the organization La Corporación. Some knew it as the Santa Ana Cartel after the town where Suárez was born. It didn't work like the Colombian groups. Suárez avoided the noise. His organization barely appeared in the press, and confrontations with other groups were settled quietly. He ran it like a family business. Everyone in the operation was from the region. The pilots and chemists had grown up in towns near Santa Ana, and many of them had known Suárez since they were children. He paid well and demanded silence. By the early 80s, La Corporación was producing most of the cocaine reaching the Colombian cartels. The Medellin cartel, led by Pablo Escobar and the Ochoa brothers, was one of its main customers. Suárez sold them paste and cocaine base by the ton. Back home, people started calling him Robin Hood. He paid scholarships for poor students and funded schools in towns the Bolivian state had forgotten. The paradox was that the cocaine he produced ended up in neighborhoods in Miami and New York, while back home he was seen as a benefactor. In 1983, Hollywood noticed. Brian De Palma released Scarface, and the character of Alejandro Sosa, the Bolivian supplier in the film, was based on him.
I have to hand it to you, Mr. Sosa. You got everything a man could want.
But money wasn't what Suárez was after. Control was. By the late 70s, he started moving in different territory. Bolivia was a country in political crisis, with unstable elections and military officers fighting each other for the presidency. Suárez saw an opening. On July 17, 1980, a group of officers led by General Luis Garcia Meza staged a coup in La Paz. They rolled tanks into the streets and arrested opponents and trade unionists from the very first night. The dictatorship lasted more than a year and would be responsible for political violence later documented by truth commissions. Behind the coup was Roberto Suárez's money. He had financed part of the operation, and the new interior minister of the regime was his cousin, Luis Arce Gómez. Cocaine stopped being a clandestine business and became state policy. While Pablo Escobar was fighting Colombia with bombs, Suárez was no longer fighting anyone. He had the country. And from that position, Roberto Suárez did something no trafficker had ever done before. In 1983, he published an open letter to President Ronald Reagan in the newspaper. In the letter, he offered to surrender to the United States. In exchange, he asked Washington to pay Bolivia's foreign debt, more than $3 billion at the time. He also asked for the release of his son, Roberto Suárez Levy, held in Miami since 1981. It was the offer of the world's biggest cocaine producer, a man who owned a country. But the letter never got a reply, and something had shifted completely. The United States already had Suárez at the top of its target list. The Garcia Meza dictatorship fell in August 1981, overthrown by internal pressure and international condemnation. Suárez's cousin, Luis Arce Gómez, would years later be extradited to the United States to face charges. And without the regime he had been the main investor of, Suárez lost his political shield. and his relationship with his biggest customer also started to deteriorate. Before the falling out, Suarez and Pablo Escobar had been close friends. Pablo called him Pelican, the Pelican. One of the most telling scenes from that friendship was told by Ida Levy, Suarez's wife, in her book, El Rey de la Cocaína, The King of Cocaine. It was 1983, a few months before Scarface premiered worldwide. Pablo traveled to Bolivia and watched the movie alongside Suarez at a private screening. When Tony Montana appeared on screen, Suarez laughed and turned to Pablo. "Look at how the gringos twist things. Who told them Montana was Cuban? My Tony Montana is Paisa from Medellin, and he's sitting right next to me." Pablo burst out laughing. What neither of them caught that night was that the real character in the movie wasn't Tony Montana. It was Alejandro Sosa, the refined Bolivian supplier who ends up having Montana killed when he breaks the rules. After that night, things started to change. Pablo had declared war on the Colombian state. Car bombs in Bogota and judges murdered outside the courthouses. Suarez hated that noise. Every bomb Pablo set off cost him a customer, because the United States responded with more pressure on the whole system. And losing his best customer and being marked by the American government left Roberto Suarez more alone than he had ever been in his life. In 1988, Bolivian agents advised by the DEA reached his ranch in northern Bolivia. Suarez didn't fight back. According to his wife, Ida Levy, he had decided himself it was time to turn himself in. They moved him to La Paz and sentenced him to 15 years in prison for drug trafficking. He was sent to San Pedro prison in the center of La Paz, a place where inmates lived with their families, bought their own cells, and where Suarez received visitors as if he were still the boss. In 1996, during the government of Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, he was released. He was 64 years old. Nothing he had built was left out there. La Corporación was gone. Pablo Escobar had been dead for 3 years. The northern Bolivia he remembered no longer existed. New trafficking networks had absorbed it, operating with the logic he had always rejected. More bombs, more hitmen, more noise. He went back to Santa Cruz de la Sierra. He bought a modest house. He stopped traveling. He spent his afternoons reading the newspaper with no bodyguards and no visitors. The man who had once brought in $400 million a year and had bought a country lived like any retired grandfather from the Bolivian Amazon. In July of 2000, Roberto Suarez died of a heart attack. He was 68 years old. Today, his name barely shows up in documentaries, and most of the world has never heard it. Pablo Escobar got the fame. The movies, the shows, the books, the urban legends. Pablo became known for his violence. But the man who produced the paste and the base was Roberto Suarez. The man who had the country Pablo never managed to have was Roberto Suarez. The real king of cocaine had always been Roberto Suarez Gomez, a Bolivian who proved you could run the most violent business in the world without firing a single shot. That's why every time someone watches Scarface, without knowing it, they're watching Roberto Suarez, the Bolivian Pablo learned the business from, the real Alejandro Sosa, the biggest cocaine producer the world has ever seen. But let's be clear, Roberto Suarez was not a hero. He was a drug trafficker who poisoned millions of people for 2 decades. The fact that he avoided bombings doesn't make him any less criminal than Pablo Escobar. In the end, they all cause the same damage. They all get rich destroying other people's lives. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And a like on the video means a lot. See you in the next one.